All right, good morning. This is the Men's Sunday School class here at Mercy Baptist Church. My name is Robert Rathbone. And this morning we're going to be in Acts chapter 27. We've been following Paul the last few chapters in his journey here. And we were right here. Well, this is one more lesson after this one. We'll be concluding Acts. But I guess set the context of this particular chapter. Paul has appealed to Caesar. The next chapter, he gives the testimony that he felt compelled to appeal to Caesar because the Jews were protesting even the idea of turning him loose, of releasing him, even though he's innocent. And the Romans would have released him because they couldn't find that he was guilty of any crime, but the Jews were protesting it so much. Paul figured if he's going to get a fair trial, he's going to have to appeal to Caesar, and so he's done this, and now Festus has little choice but to send Paul, because Paul is a Roman citizen, so if he says, hey, I appeal to Caesar, then he pretty much has to give him his right to be heard by Caesar. So Festus has no choice but to send Paul to Rome, and he's going to board a ship in this chapter and in the custody of a Roman centurion, and he is going to be sent to Rome. And it's not a uneventful trip. It's not a cruise. It's not like he's getting on a cruise ship and just sailing, and he gets to relax until he gets to Rome. There's a lot that happens here, but as we're going to see here, God is in control. He is in control over the whole thing. In fact, the more I read this and think about it and study it, I believe that God, the turmoil that Paul goes through here was sent by God, not as a punishment. Some people think that Paul went to Jerusalem contrary to the will of God, and thereby he was arrested. But I think God wants Paul to go to Rome, and even as we'll see in this chapter here, stand before Caesar himself and be able to testify to the Lord Jesus Christ. So this is all God's will. Even landing on this island of the island of Melita, which we barely see him getting there. But then next week, although our book I think has us skipping over those verses, but he spends some time on the island of Melita, which is modern-day Malta, and it doesn't say that he preached to them or taught them about Jesus Christ, but he did heal a lot of people, and I find it hard to believe that Paul would spend as much time, I think at least 3 months, on this island, and I find it hard to believe that he did not say one word about Jesus Christ. So I think he became a witness for Jesus Christ there, as he did everywhere he went. And all this was in the will of God. So let's, before we get going in it, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank you again for your love, your mercy, your grace, Father. Thank you, Lord, that you are sovereignly in control, Father. And as we see your sovereign hand, Father, in Paul's life in this chapter, I pray, help us in turn to be able to recognize your sovereign hand in our own lives, Father, that even when it looks like everything is falling apart and things are hopeless, that we can see, Father, that you're in control of it all. So all these things we ask in the precious name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, our book has us starting in verse 14, so we have the context and understand what's going on. In verses 1 through 13, A Roman centurion named Julius is assigned to transport Paul and a number of other prisoners to Rome. And so he takes them aboard a ship, and they set sail from Caesarea, and then they have a short stopover at Sidon, and then they get back on the ship and they continue sailing, and they sail past Cyprus, and they're keeping the island between them and the contrary winds so that they can continue to make progress toward Italy. Then they change ships at a place called Myra, and there the centurion found one that was sailing to Italy, so they board that ship. But then their progress slows to a crawl because of contrary winds blowing in the wrong direction. Because you got to remember, they don't have motorboats, they don't have engines, they don't have anything. The sole means of propulsion on the sea was the wind, and so if they didn't have the wind, because these ships are too big, I think, or not equipped for rowing, so if the winds aren't blowing the right direction, then you're pretty much stuck. You're at the mercy of the wind. There are techniques of that you can use the wind, even though it's not blowing in the ideal direction that you can. But if it's blowing right smack in your face and you can't go, then this is what they find out. In fact, there's a lot of I'm trying to think of the right word. It's the marine or mariners' techniques and things here in this chapter. But anyway, they slow to a crawl because of those contrary winds, and it takes them several days to reach a harbor that's called Fair Havens. When this is on the southern coast of Crete. But by this time, it was so late in the year that sailing had become dangerous because they have to. They're at the mercy of the winds, and so they have to be very weather conscious in those days. And because it was the seasonal weather patterns of that late in the year made it very dangerous to sail. And so Paul advises them and says that, hey, attempting to sail now would result in the loss of the ship, its cargo, and the lives of all on board. But the centurion, and from a human standpoint, this makes sense. The centurion trusts the expertise of the ship's captain, more than he does Paul, because Paul's not a sailor. These guys are experienced sailors, so he trusts their opinion instead of Paul's. And the captain had decided that since the harbor of Fair Havens was not suitable for wintering, that it was going to be worth the risk to sail further west until they found a more suitable harbor for spending the winter. And so when a gentle south wind began blowing, they thought, this is it. This is our chance. Let's go for it. So they do, and they set sail again. All right, so we come to verse 14. So they're attempting to sail west. It says, but not long after, there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. All right, so they thought they had the south, this gentle wind blowing south. They thought we can use that. We'll sail west, but they hadn't gone very far before that gentle wind goes away and is replaced by a tempestuous wind, and it is given a name. Like we have like these weather patterns like El Nino and such things. Well, this was a type of wind, of storm that Mediterranean sailors feared, and they had given that name Euroclydon. And now commentators point out that the best manuscripts give the name as Euroquilo, which is a compound word from Greek, with combining a Greek word and a Latin word, and putting them together, it means a northeast wind. And so it seems this particular wind is blowing in the dead opposite direction of where they needed to go. And so it says, and when the ship was caught, in other words, they couldn't make any more forward progress. The wind was just blowing right in their face, and they just couldn't make any progress. They couldn't. And it says they could not bear up into the wind. They couldn't. There's some sort of method, and I haven't figured out how it works. But the wind can be blowing kind of contrary, and you can go back and forth, and it somehow gives you propulsion, and you can move forward. Well, apparently this is they were not able to bear up into the wind, and they couldn't make any forward progress. So they had no choice. It says we let her drive. In other words, all they could do was let the wind and the waves take the ship where they wanted to go, because it was pointless to try to steer a course. So verse 16, it says, and running under a certain island which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps, undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksand, strake sail, and so were driven. So we see here a lot of things that mariners would do. A lot of maybe not so much terminology, but these are things that mariners, that sailors would have to deal with in that day. It says, running under a certain island which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat. So they were running under a certain island, which means they were putting the island between them and the wind, which kind of the island would block the wind to a certain extent. And so it gave them just a little bit of relief. But then it says, while they were doing that, it says we had much work to come by the boat. This boat refers to a skiff or a lifeboat that was towed behind the boat in case of an emergency. And so when they had the island between them and the wind, they were using that opportunity, that certain amount of relief from the wind. They used that as an opportunity to bring the lifeboat aboard the ship and secure it so that they wouldn't lose it in rough seas. Now it says we had much work to come by. So even with the certain amount of blockage of the wind from the island, it still was hard work. It was still difficult for them to get that lifeboat aboard the ship. And then it says, which when they had taken up, in other words, when they had gotten it aboard and they'd taken it up and secured it, hoisted it aboard and secured it, it says they used helps undergirding the ship. The word helps there, it refers to ropes that they used, and they used it to undergird the ship. And this is a procedure called frapping, F-R-A-P-P-I-N-G, and it was used by sailors to prepare the ship for rough seas. They would wrap the hull with these ropes, and they would winch them tight, and it would make the hull more solid because it was tightened up and compressed up, and it helped it to ride the waves better, to endure the beating of the waves against the ship and just the rough seas. All right, then it says, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, they strake sail, and so were driven. So they've got the lifeboat aboard the ship, and their next concern was worrying about the quicksands, or these are sandbars. The northern coast of Africa, which the Mediterranean Sea borders, Europe and then Africa there. Anyway, the northern coast of Africa was notorious for having these sandbars where ships became a ship graveyard, and so they were worried that they might the wind would drive them down into these sandbars, and they would get stuck and be shipwrecked. And so because of that, it says they strake sail, and so were driven. And the Greek word for strake means to lower. The Greek word for sail It can refer to the vessel itself, but it can refer to tackle. It can refer to the sail. Any kind of equipment that they use for sailing aboard the ship. And so, including the anchor. And so commentators believe that they were, when they said they strake sail, that meant they lowered the sails, because as long as the sails are up, the wind was going to be pushing them everywhere. They didn't want to get pushed where they had no control, so they didn't want to get into those sandbars, so they lowered the sails, and a lot of commentators think they probably lowered anchors as well. And this would try to keep the ship from pretty much stay where it was at and not get pushed all the way down to the African coast and them getting shipwrecked in the sandbars. So they did this, and this is animals were so driven, so they were basically at the mercy of the wind. They're holding on as best they can with their sails lowered and the anchors dropped to try to hold their position. So verse 18 says, "And being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. And the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship." All right, so it says the following day they lightened the ship, because they were being exceedingly tossed by the tempest. They were in rough waters. This was a tough thing, for these experienced sailors. And it says next day they lightened the ship, and then we'll take note here of the changing of the pronoun here in a second. But it says they lightened the ship. They may have thrown off some of the cargo. They may have thrown off some unnecessary things, maybe even personal items, things of weight that would reduce the weight of the ship so that it wouldn't set so low in the water, and so it would be less of a chance of it sinking. And but then it says, and then on the third day, so apparently they were still concerned that they hadn't lightened it enough, and it says the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. Now we've seen earlier in Acts, whenever Paul or Luke is writing and he says, they did this, but then he says, but we did this. We take that as an indication that Luke is, he's personally there. He's an eyewitness to this, and he's taking part in what's going on. When he says they lightened the ship, he may be referring to the sailors themselves, the crew of the ship. They were doing this. They were doing what? Just to save their own ship. They're doing these things to, as crew. But now it says on the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. So apparently they recruited passengers. It says everybody on board, hey, we're, all of our lives are at stake, so we all have an interest in this. We all need to help. And so apparently they got everybody to help. And it says we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. So it's more weight, and apparently this is everything except maybe the most essential tackling of the ship, the rigging, the things that they need, that they had to have. Everything else, I guess, may have been extras or nice to haves or whatever, but they're getting rid of everything that they could possibly get rid of and still be able to sail the ship in order to lighten it. So verse 20 says, "And then when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away." All right, so they have endured several days by now of stormy skies, and there was no end in sight. It said neither the sun nor the stars in many days had appeared, and there's no small tempest. In other words, this wasn't a little tempest. This was a huge tempest. Something that's pushing probably the worst thing that these sailors had ever experienced. themselves. And these sailors, they use the sun, they use the stars for navigation. So they went several days not being able to see the sun, not being able to see the stars. And so they have lost complete track of where they're at. They have no idea where they're at. They don't know which way is north, south, east, west. They don't know what direction they're pointed. And so because they're in this storm, it is no small tempest. It is a huge storm, and there's no end in sight. And so it says all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. So apparently everybody on the ship, from the experienced sailors all the way down to the passengers who had little or no knowledge of sailing, they had started losing hope. And presumably Paul and his companions, Luke, and I think at the first of this chapter it talks about Aristarchus, which was somebody they encountered earlier in Acts and became a friend of Paul's. He is along for the ride, but apparently all these people, including Paul, have begun to lose hope that they're going to survive this trip. All right, so then verse 21, it says, "But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss." All right, so it says after long abstinence. The Greek word there for abstinence, it means fasting, but Paul's not fasting, in the religious sense. He's not fasting for the Lord. Apparently this, in fact, we'll see here in a few verses, nobody has been eating. Is this long abstinence? In other words, they have went a long time, several days already, without eating. And the commentators believe it's probably because between the the emotional stress of we're not going to survive, the fact that they're going through in seas this rough, even the experienced sailors were probably experiencing seasickness, and so nobody had an appetite. But Paul chooses, this is after this long abstinence, after this long period of time, and they've not eaten, Paul chooses to use this time to step forward and because he has something to report. And he says, "Sirs, you should have hearkened unto me, and not loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss." So it kind of sounds like Paul's trying to say, well, hey, I told you so. You should have listened to me. I told you, but would you listen to me? No, that's not what Paul's doing here. He's not trying to say, I told you so. He's saying, look, before, you should have listened to me before, and you didn't, and you see what happened. I'm about to tell you something now, and I was right before, so you should, he's lending credence to what he's about to say. You should have listened to me before, and so now you should listen to me now. All right, so verse 22, he says, "And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar. And lo, God hath given all them that sail with thee." So Paul, he says, look, you guys can cheer up now. It's, we've all had the idea that we're not going to survive. We've given up hope. He says, but I want you to be of good cheer. I want you to be encouraged and be happy, because he says there'll be no loss of any man's life. We're all going to survive this. He says, but we are going to lose the ship. They've already lost pretty much, or a lot of the cargo. I think later on they do toss the cargo, or more of the cargo. But he's saying, look, we can be encouraged and be of good cheer because we're going to live. And how does he know this? He says, for there stood by me this night an angel of God, whose I am and whose I serve. So he knows this because God has sent him a message through an angel, and he's telling him, and it says this night. So apparently either the angel had just left and Paul says, well, I got to tell everybody else, or he sat there and thought about it for a little bit and then decided he was going to tell everybody. But it hasn't been long since the angel had come to Paul and given him the message. But he says, an angel of God appeared to me. He says, whose I am and whose I serve. This is my God that I serve. I'm a servant of God, and I belong to him, and he's my God, and he sent an angel to give me this message. So he's basically telling him, this is why you can trust what I'm about to tell you, because it comes directly from God. And the message is saying, fear not, Paul, for thou must be brought before Caesar. That word must basically means it was ordained, or it's God's plan. It's something that's going to happen because God has willed that it's going to happen. So he says, fear not, Paul, because thou must be brought before Caesar. Now God had already told him that he was going to Rome back in Acts 23 verse 11. And so God repeats the promise that he's going, but he adds the detail that Paul is going to stand before Caesar himself. You see, circumstances can never stand in the way of God's sovereign plan. What God dictates is going to happen is going to happen. So he says, don't worry, Paul. You're not going to die out here in the middle of the ocean or the middle of the sea. God's already dictated that you are going to stand before Caesar. And he says, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. So, and no doubt Paul has been praying for the entire ship, for everybody on board, that they would all survive. And now God says, look, I'm answering that prayer. I've given you all these that are sailing with thee. I'm protecting you, and I'm putting everybody else on the ship under that umbrella of protection that I'm giving you. All right, so verse 25, it says, wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. So he repeats the encouragement. It says, be of good cheer, what he said in verse 22. Now these people, these sailors, they're pagans. They've not, they're not Christians. They're Romans. They are believe in their own gods, and so they could have easily have dismissed what Paul said. Well, that's just wishful thinking. He's just saying that, but he says, look, I believe God. He says this came from God, and I trust what God has told me, and that it will be even as as it was told me. That what God said would happen is going to happen. All right, so our book has us skipping down to verse 33, but from verse 26 through 32, Paul has one more detail to what God had told him would happen, that it would be necessary for them to run aground upon an island. Then it says, on the 14th day since the storm began, the sailors become aware that they are nearing land. This might be because they heard waves crashing on the seashore, but they test the depth of the water, and then when they're realizing that they are entering shallow water, they're worried that they're going to run aground, so they drop their anchor so they ship wouldn't be driven upon the rocks, and then they wait for daylight to come. But now there were some sailors on board that were trying to abandon ship. They They pretended to drop the anchors, but in reality they were planning on lowering the lifeboat and getting on it and sailing away and leaving the rest of the people on board. So they were abandoned. But Paul warns the centurion that their survival was dependent on the sailors remaining in the ship. So the centurion had his soldiers cut the ropes, let the lifeboat fall into the water, and so nobody else could make that attempt to escape. So verse 33 says, and while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, this is the 14th day that you have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. For there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you. So he's urging them to eat because, like we saw earlier back in verse 21, it had been days since they had eaten, and now it's been 14 days since any of them had eaten. I think from the emotional distress of them thinking they're going to die, from the seasickness, nobody had an appetite. But he says, look, everybody, we all need to eat because it's been 14 days. So he says, I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. In other words, you can't just continue on like this. You got to eat. Get your strength up. I lost my place here. And then he says, for there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you. So he's saying, look, you don't have to forego eating because you're going to live. You need to eat for your health, for your strength, because you're going to live. I mean, it does seem kind of pointless if you think you're going to die. Why should I take care of my health? Why should I, eat or whatever if I'm just going to turn around and die anyway? But he says, look, you're going to live, so you need to eat for your health. And so verse 35, and when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. And then they were all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. So when he was watching them eat, when they were watching him eat, well, he took the bread and gave thanks to God. He's giving thanks to the God that had promised him that, that they were all going to survive. And he does this before everybody, so I guess that began to eat. I guess sometimes the behavior of others can be infectious and influence us. Like in wartime, if your buddy is scared to death and he's wanting to run, that's going to influence you to make you feel scared and cowardly. But if he's standing brave, then that's going to make you want to feel brave too. And I think it's just kind of the same effect here. He's thanking God for the food. He eats it. And when they see him eat, I think the fact that they were all starving to death and seeing him eat, that makes you want to eat when you see somebody else eat. And then the fact that he's, I guess, being encouraging, that also encouraged them. But so they were all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. And then verse 37, it says, and they were all in the ship, 260 souls. That's 276 people. And I kind of sort of have a breakdown of that, of what it could be, because assuming the centurion had his full 100 soldiers under him, that would be, and then Paul, and the centurion, that'd be 102 people. Then you had Luke and Aristarchus. It gives you, at least they were on the ship. And so that leaves still 172 people, which is probably composed of sailors, prisoners, and then other passengers on the ship. But apparently the whole reason Luke is giving us the number, he wants to see how much of an impact it is, how many people here were witness to Paul, him testifying of Jesus Christ, of the angel speaking to him, and him giving thanks to God, and everything that happened. That this was an impact. It impacted 276 people here. All right, so that's all the verses that our book has for us. So 38 through 44. After eating, they cast the remaining cargo of the wheat into the sea in order to lighten the ship further. Then by the light of the day, sailors were able to see a spot where they could safely run the ship aground. And so when they attempt to do that, the ship gets stuck further ashore than they hoped. The soldiers want to kill the prisoners to prevent them from escaping, but the centurion, who wants to protect Paul, he prevents them from doing what they plan to do. And then everybody is able to make it to shore either by swimming, or those that couldn't swim, were hanging on to floating debris. So everybody makes it ashore safely. So what God told Paul did come to pass. Now they end up there on the island of Melita, which is the modern day name of the island is Malta, and that's in the next chapter, but which our book has us skipping over that part of it. But if you study the whole chapter, you'll see the events, things that happened to Paul while he's there on the island. But we'll pick up in chapter 28, final chapter of Acts, next week.